The smell of burnt circuits had a way of tickling the nostrils, much like a punch in the face tickles your ego. Captain Vance Lucky Clayton inhaled deeply, savoring the aroma of yet another disaster aboard the Intrepid Dawn. "Ah, the sweet scent of impending doom," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he stood at the helm of their beleaguered floating hunk of metal. "Smells like another delightful Tuesday," quipped Rizal, the ship's engineer, who was elbow-deep in the open console, surrounded by a halo of tangled wires that looked like a bird's nest designed by a particularly disgruntled sparrow. Rizal's hands moved with the speed and grace of someone who'd spent one too many nights playing Operation with real consequences. "Anyone feel like the universe is playing a prank, and we're the punchline?" said Mags, the ship's medic, as she leaned against the bulkhead. Her perpetual grimace suggested she'd seen enough space horror to know there's no such thing as a routine maintenance check, especially when the routine involved unidentifiable slime oozing from the ventilation shafts. "We getting paid extra for overtime on this one?" asked Harv, the ship's pilot, staring at the flashing emergency lights with all the enthusiasm of a dead fish. His feet were propped up on the control panel, because if they were going to go down with the ship, he might as well be comfortable. "Sure," Captain Vance replied dryly. "I'll double your usual pay." 2 times 0 is still 0, right?" Harv grunted, shifting his weight. "You know, if we get through this, the first thing I'm doing is investing in a nice planet-side beach chair. If we get through this," Mags added, "I'll join you just so I can push you off it." The klaxon blared, a sound that had become their constant soundtrack. It was either that or the haunting silence of the void. An argument could be made for the latter being less mentally taxing. "Rizal, you getting anywhere with that?" Vance asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Oh yeah, sure," Rizal replied, voice muffled by the console. "I just told the circuits to play nice and they're thinking it over." Mags rolled her eyes. "A motivational speaker now, are we? Maybe try bribing them with cookies." Rizal snorted. "If only we had cookies. Or anything edible, really." "Focus, children," Vance said, straightening up. "We've got bigger problems than snacks. Like, for instance, what's currently clogging up our air filters?" The ship shuddered, a subtle reminder that they were not alone in their desolate slice of space. Something was definitely amiss, and if their mutual luck held out, it was likely to be something both unpleasant and life-threatening. "All right, let's get the bird back in the sky," Vance ordered, knowing full well they were already in the sky or the cosmic equivalent thereof. "Harv, keep us on course. Rizal, make the magic happen. Mags, keep everyone alive." "And what'll you do, Cap?" Harv asked. "Me. I'll supervise, of course," Vance replied with a grin that was more teeth than humor. As Rizal continued her tango with the ship's innards, she grumbled, "If I had a credit for every time this ship tried to kill me, I'd own my own planet by now." "If you had a credit for every time this ship tried to kill you, you'd probably still owe it money," Harv shot back. "Oh, good, a mutiny," Mag said, rolling her eyes. "That's exactly what we need right now." "Mutiny requires planning, and who has time for that?" Rizal replied, still consumed by her work. Just then, the ship lurched violently, sending loose tools and unsecured crew members flying. Vance caught himself on a console, cursing under his breath. "What the hell was that?" "Looks like we've got our answer," Rizal said grimly, pulling a fistful of alien gunk from the depths of the ship's guts. "Meet your new unwelcome guests." "Charming," Mags muttered, eyeing the goo with distaste. "Can we evict them, or are we in for another messy divorce?" "Depends on your definition of messy," Rizal replied, squinting at the slime as if it might suddenly explain its existence. "Messy," Harv said, "is when it involves a mop." "If it involves a mop," Vance said with resignation, "then it's definitely messy." The ship's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced like malevolent spirits. "So, Captain," Mags asked, "what's the plan?" "Plan," Vance repeated, scratching his chin. "The plan is we don't die, everything else we improvise." Rizal tossed the goo into a waste receptacle. "Improvisation. Definitely my strongest skill. And charming good looks," Harv added with a smirk. "I'm married to the job, not my reflection," Rizat shot back, her focus returning to the mess of circuits before her. With a suddenness that felt almost scripted, the ship shivered again, a mechanical groan echoing through its corridors. It was a sound all too familiar to the crew, a distress call from the Dawn herself. "Looks like she's got more to say," Vance said, patting the wall like one might comfort a temperamental cat. "Yeah," Mags said, "and it sounds like we're screwed." Rizad disconnected another panel, revealing more of the ship's viscera infested with alien strands. These are multiplying faster than rumors in a spaceport, and just as reliable, Vance noted. "Harv, any chance of getting a distress call out?" Harv shook his head. "Comms are down. Whatever this is, it must have chewed through our lines." "Of course it did," Mags said, her voice deadpan. "Why solve one problem when you can have a dozen?" "Optimism," Rizaz said, her fingers a blur of activity. "It's overrated." "Don't you dare get hopeful on me," Vance warned. "We might actually survive this." Rizaz snorted. "Survival, another day, another chance to be killed by something new. Ever the ray of sunshine," Harv said, adjusting his seat. "I'm the whole damn sun," Rizal replied, flicking a switch experimentally. There was a hopeful whir, then a pop, and a distinctly unpleasant smell filled the air. "Burnt toast," Mags said, wrinkling her nose. "My favorite." "We're not dead yet," Vance said, more to himself than anyone else. "That's the spirit," Harv agreed. "Dying's just such a boring way to end the day." The ship settled into an uneasy calm, a truce between its mechanical ailments and the alien intrusion. "Okay," Vance said, looking at his crew. "Let's see if we can make it to tomorrow without becoming alien chow." "Tomorrow," Mags mused. "Always something to look forward to, or dread." Rizat chuckled darkly. "Here's to hoping dread wins this time." Vance nodded, sensing the growing tension among his crew. "All right, focus. Let's get this beast back on her feet." "Feet?" Harv asked, raising an eyebrow. "We getting legs installed next?" "You know what I mean," Vance replied, not missing a beat. Their banter was interrupted by another ominous groan from the Dawn, like a whale mourning its solitude in the cosmic sea. "We need a plan," Vance mused, "or at least a better idea than don't die." "I've got bad news and worse news," Rizaz said, pulling herself out from the guts of the ship. "Bad news is we're out of duct tape, and the worst news?" Mags asked. "This slime," Rizaz said, holding up a sample. "It's alive." "Of course it is," Harv sighed. "Wouldn't be fun otherwise." Vance took the slimy sample from Rizaz, holding it up to the light. "Well, at least it's not laughing at us yet." Mags peered over his shoulder. "Give it time." "All right," Vance said, his tone suddenly serious. "Let's get this sorted before it decides we're next on the menu." "Sounds like a plan, Captain," Rizal replied, her expression a mix of grim determination and weary acceptance. The crew got to work, each falling into their roles with a practiced ease born from too many close calls and not enough wins. They were tired, cynical, and just a bit broken, but if there was one thing they understood, it was how to fight against the odds. As they labored, the alien menace lurked in the shadows, waiting, watching. Whatever it was, it had underestimated the tenacity of the human spirit, scrappy, irreverent, and always ready for a fight. "Hey, Harv," Vance called out, a hint of mischief in his voice. "Yeah, Cap, you know any good jokes?" Harv thought for a moment. "Why did the spaceship break up with the asteroid?" "Why?" Mags asked, curiosity piqued despite herself. "It needed space," Harv replied, smirking. The crew groaned collectively, the sound echoing through the Intrepid Dawn. It was a poor joke, but in the face of uncertainty, even a groan could be a sign of life. A defiance against the darkness closing in around them. Vance chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, let's focus, people. We're not dead yet, and I've got a bet with death that I intend to win." With that, the crew of the Intrepid Dawn threw themselves back into the fray, determined to fix what they could and survive what they couldn't. In the desolate stretch of space they were stranded in, they were all they had, scrappy, irreverent, and impossibly stubborn. And as long as they had breath in their bodies, they would fight against the dying of the light. Even if it meant laughing in the face of annihilation. The Intrepid Dawn groaned like an old man trying to stand up from a low couch. Every mechanical whine and clunk signifying something important was probably about to fail catastrophically. Captain Vance Lucky Clayton wasn't feeling particularly lucky as he stood in the cramped, dimly lit control room, looking at his crew like a man who knew he had the winning hand in a game of Russian roulette. Rizal was still elbow-deep in the ship's guts, muttering curses that would singe a nun's ears. Her hair was sticking up at angles normally reserved for abstract art, and her face was smudged with grime, possibly from the ship, possibly from whatever alien muck she'd been wrestling with. "Rizal," Vance called, his voice cutting through the room like a dull blade, "you got a handle on our little guest problem." "Define handle," she shot back, not looking up from her station. "If you mean am I about to solve this with sheer genius, then no. If you mean am I making it up as I go along, then yes, absolutely." "Splendid," Vance replied with mock cheer. "Remember, folks, failure is not an option. It's a default setting. You're a motivational speaker trapped in a pessimist's body, Vance," Mags chimed in, noting the dark circles under her eyes with a casual indifference that spoke volumes about the situation's severity. "Somebody's gotta keep morale lower than our fuel reserves," Vance replied. He turned his attention to Harv, who was fiddling with the controls like a man trying to tune a vintage radio. "Harv, how's our course looking?" "Straight into the abyss unless you're suggesting a quick detour through some black hole," Harv said with a shrug. "Not much we can do with the inertial dampeners partying like it's their last night on duty." "And it could be," Rizal added with a grim smile. "Live every day like it's your last, especially if you're on this ship." Vance shook his head, a resigned grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I always said I'd die surrounded by my closest friends. I just didn't think it would happen quite so soon." "I don't want to panic anyone," Mags interrupted, "but I just checked on the crew in cryo. Something weird is happening." "Weird as in they're waking up?" Vance asked, hope igniting briefly before being snuffed out by reality's waterlogged blanket. "Weirder," Mags replied, her voice taking on a serious edge. "They're glowing." "Glowing," Harv repeated, eyebrows shooting up. "Like I just ate a bad burrito glowing or I'm about to sprout tentacles glowing." "I'm betting on tentacles," Rizak quipped. "Because why not?" Vance sighed. "All right, Mags, let's have a look." They headed to the cryo chamber, the sound of their footsteps echoing ominously. It was a dismal place, like a morgue that someone had tried to make cozy with a few strategic posters and a motivational quote or two. The cryopods lined the walls, each one glowing an unsettling shade of green. "Well," Vance mused, "that's new." "Understatement of the year," Mags replied. "Something's affecting them. Could be the slime, could be cosmic rays, hell, could even be boredom." "How's this for a thought?" Rizaz said, eyeing the pods with a mix of fascination and horror. "Maybe our little alien friends thought they'd throw us a welcome party." "Great," Vance said, rolling his eyes. "Just what I wanted, parasitic party favors." "Look at the bright side," Harv said, popping up beside them like an unwanted reminder that things could always get worse. "At least they're not asking us to join in." "Yet," Rizat added pointedly. As if on cue, the ship shuddered, followed by the unsettling sound of metal screaming in protest. The lights flickered, and for a moment they were plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like the universe had simply forgotten them. Then, with a reluctant hum, the lights returned. "I really hate it when the dawn does that," Mags muttered, inspecting the pods with a clinical eye. "She's a capricious mistress," Vance said, leaning against a pod. "Kind of like life and death. And whatever this is we're dealing with." "Cap," Harv cut in, his voice suddenly sharp, "we got another problem." "Because of course we do," Vance replied without missing a beat. "What is it?" "Comms are down completely, we're cut off." "Fantastic," Vance said, clapping his hands together with feigned enthusiasm. "Just when I was planning to call for takeout." "No comms means no backup," Mags said, her expression dark. "And no backup means we're on our own." "Is it really a surprise?" Rizat asked, plugging away at her console. "The universe hates us, has for a while now." "I prefer to think of it as tough love," Harv said, a crooked grin on his face. "Keeps us on our toes." Sure, Vance agreed, because what we really need right now is a cosmic boot camp. Razaz sighed, rubbing her temples. We're dealing with something new here, Cap. The sort of new that usually ends in creative obituaries. Well, let's not jump to conclusions, Vance said, crossing his arms. For all we know, this could be a good thing. And I'm a unicorn, Mags replied dryly. All right, Vance said, straightening up. We need a new plan. Something that involves not dying and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to make these parasites go back to where they came from. Maybe we can reason with them, Harv suggested. You know, say hey, you can have the ship, just leave us a lifeboat. Or we could set them up with a nice airbeam on a nearby asteroid, Mags added. Nice thought, Vance said, but I doubt they're here for the sightseeing. Razaz stood up, brushing off her hands. We're not getting out of this by chatting or joking. We need to find out how these things tick and fast. Right, Vance agreed. Mags, you and Razaz check the lab, see if there's anything useful in their scans data, a conveniently forgotten ray gun. And what about the glowing crew? Mags asked. Leave him be for now, Vance said. Last thing we need is for them to wake up cranky or hungry, or both, Harv added with a shiver. As Razaz and Mags headed off towards the lab, Harv and Vance stayed behind, contemplating the cryopods. You ever wonder if we bit off more than we could chew, Harv? Vance asked, his voice low. All the time, Cap, Harv replied with a rueful smile. But then I remember if we didn't, life would be pretty damn boring. True enough, Vance said, sighing. Let's just hope we don't choke on it. Meanwhile, in the lab, Razaz and Mags were elbow-deep in a search for anything that might give them an edge. The place was a chaotic mess of equipment, half-finished projects, and a suspicious amount of empty coffee cups. Any luck? Mags asked, carefully avoiding a precarious tower of paperwork. Depends on your definition of luck, Razaz replied, frowning at a screen. I've got some readings here, but they might as well be in Sanskrit. Whatever these parasites are, they are rewriting biology as we know it. Great, Mags said, rolling her eyes. Bioengineering space slugs. Just what the doctor ordered. Hey, maybe when we get out of this we can write a paper, Razaz suggested with a wry grin. Call it Survival of the Snarkiest, a study in terrible life choices. I'll start on the introduction, Mags said, flipping through a dusty manual. Page 1. It all started with a stubborn crew too stupid to give up. And too stubborn to die, Razaz added, her fingers flying over the keyboard. All right, I've got something. It's not much, but it's a start. These parasites, they're not just attached to the crew. They're interacting with them on a genetic level. Interacting how? Mags asked, leaning over to look at the screen. Looks like enhancements, Razaz said. Strength, reflexes, maybe even some kind of mental boost. Side effects include glowing and, potential death. Of course, the universe gives with one hand and takes with the other, Mags said, shaking her head. So what do we do with this info? Not much we can do right now, Razaz replied. But it's better than shooting in the dark. Speaking of shooting, Mags said, think we should arm up, just in case. Can't hurt, Razaz agreed. Besides, I'll feel better with something that goes boom. As they prepared to leave the lab, the ship shuddered again, more violently this time. The lights flickered and a low, ominous hum filled the air, a constant reminder that their time was running out. Back in the control room, Vance and Harv were staring at the monitors, trying to make sense of the data. Any bright ideas? Harv asked, glancing sideways at Vance. Just one, Vance said, tapping a finger against his chin. We need to find a way to communicate, not just with the crew but with these parasites. Harv raised an eyebrow. You want to have a chat with the things trying to kill us? Why not? Vance answered with a shrug. Beats waiting around for them to figure out how to eat us. Can't argue with that, Harv said, his usual smirk replaced by a rare look of determination. All right, Cap, let's see if we can make some new friends. As the crew continued their desperate gambit to understand and communicate with their unwelcome guests, the Intrepid dawn floated through the cold void, an island of tenacity and sarcasm in a galaxy that couldn't care less. And whether by grit or sheer stubbornness, Vance and his team were determined to live to fight another day, or at least die trying. Vance leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the half-dead control room like it owed him money. Well, Harv, if we can't talk to each other, maybe we should start talking to ourselves. I hear it's good for morale. Harv, fiddling with a detached panel where wires seem to have had a rave, grunted in reply. I talk to myself all the time, Cap. Ain't helped my morale one bit, just makes me wonder about my sanity. If you're worrying about it, you're still sane, Vance said with a shrug. It's the ones who don't worry that you've got to look out for. Speaking of worries, Mags said, bustling in with Rizah, both of them looking like they'd been in a fight with a particularly ferocious coffee machine. We've got a bit of a mixed bag with the crew. Define mixed, Vance said, narrowing his eyes. Are we talking trail mix or biohazard? Rizah dropped into the nearest chair, which protested with an alarming creak. We've got some crew waking up feeling like they could wrestle a meteor and win. Others, well, let's just say they're making a strong case for being left in cryo. Just what we need, Harv muttered. Superhumans and the walking dead. Yeah, Vance said, rubbing his temples. Exactly the kind of diversity I wasn't hoping for. Mags leaned against the console, eyeing Vance. So what's the plan, fearless leader? Besides waiting for the ship to crumple like a cheap suit in a rainstorm. First, we need to figure out who draws the short straw in the genetic lottery, Vance replied. Then we figure out how to use it to our advantage. Divide and conquer, Rizah said wryly. Or in this case, divide and try not to die. Why do I get the feeling we're all out of straws? Harv asked, tapping at his console with increasing frustration. Because the universe is fresh out of mercy, Vance said, glancing at the cryo chamber's monitor. All right, let's break it down. Mags, I want a list of who's who and what's what. Rizah, stick with her and see if you can figure out a way to stabilize the ones going all glow in the dark. And you? Rizah asked, already halfway out the door. I'm going to have a heart-to-heart with our radioactive crew, Vance said, grinning like a man with nothing left to lose. Harv, keep the ship from imploding while I'm gone. Sure, Cap, Harv said with a mock salute. I'll just staple some duct tape on reality and hope it holds. Vance waved them off, turning to the cryopods. All right, let's see what we're dealing with. As the crew dispersed, the atmosphere in the cryo chamber was as cheerful as a funeral parlor. Vance tapped on the glass of one pod, watching the occupants' glowing form with a mixture of curiosity and concern. You know, if we get out of this alive, you'll be a hit at parties, he muttered. Just think of the savings on glow sticks. The crew member inside, trembling and sweating under the eerie glow, did not respond. Vance sighed, moving to the next pod. This one contained someone who looked less luminescent but more pissed off. Hey buddy, we're trying to work out the kinks of this whole new abilities thing, Vance said, keeping his tone light. Got any requests for superpowers while I'm at it? The man in the pod opened his eyes and Vance was met with an unsettling intensity. Just get us out of this mess, Cap. Working on it, Vance said, stepping back. In the meantime, keep glowing. At least it's good for morale. Leaving the cryo chamber, Vance felt the weight of their predicament settle in. The corridors of the Intrepid dawn felt like they were closing in, the ship's creaks and groans a constant reminder of its frailty. In the makeshift communal area, the crew members not affected by the parasite's side effects had gathered. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, or maybe a blunt spoon. Whichever was handier. All right, listen up, Vance announced as he entered, his voice cutting through the murmur of worried conversations. We're all in this together, and if we're going to make it out alive, we need to work as a team. Team's looking a bit lopsided, someone called out, the cynicism cutting through the room like a laser. Yeah, well, welcome to life, Vance replied, unfazed. Fairness is a luxury we can't afford. Now if you've got a glow or a boost, let's use it. If you're feeling worse for wear, don't worry, we'll find a way to get you back on your feet. Or our knees, someone else interjected, causing a ripple of laughter to break the tension. At least you're keeping your sense of humor, Vance said, a smile tugging at his lips. Even if the universe is hell-bent on making us the butt of every cosmic joke, Rizah and Mags returned, Mags with a tablet in hand. Here's what we've got so far, Mag said, handing it over to Vance. "A few with enhanced abilities, some who might be beyond saving, and a handful who are showing no effects at all." "Great," Vance said, flipping through the data. "So we've got super soldiers, casualties, and benchwarmers." "Pretty much," Rizal replied. "The ones who are enhanced, if we can keep them stable, might give us the edge we need." "And the rest?" Vance asked. "We try to help them as best we can," Mag said, her voice softer. "But resources are running thin. We can't sustain everyone if things keep going south." "Well, ain't that the plot twist of the century?" Vance muttered, rubbing his chin. "All right, let's focus on keeping the enhanced ones in fighting shape. We might just need their help to get out of this." He turned back to the assembled crew, his expression hardening. "We're scraping the bottom of the barrel here, folks, but it's a barrel we've got to make do with." The mood was grim but determined. Resignation had been replaced by steely resolve, the kind that comes when you've got nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. As Vance continued to rally the crew, Harv tinkered away at the comms system, determined to bring it back to life. The wires seemed to laugh at his efforts, sparking and twisting like serpents in heat. "Damn it, you blasted piece of junk," Harv muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'd trade my left arm for a manual right now." "Talking to yourself again, Harv?" Vance asked, joining him. "Careful or you'll end up like the rest of us." "Too late," Harv replied, not looking up from his work. "But I've managed to get something. Might not be much, but it should let us send out a signal. Question is, who are we calling?" "The Ghostbusters," Vance suggested. "But seriously, let's try to reach any friendly ship or station in range. We might get lucky." "Luck's been in short supply lately," Harv said, adjusting a few more settings. "But hey, it's worth a shot." As Harv worked on sending out a distress signal, Vance returned to the bridge, the weight of leadership pressing down on him like a cosmic anvil. The glow from the pods cast an unsettling green hue over everything, turning the bridge into something out of a horror film. "We're going to need a miracle," Vance said to no one in particular, staring out at the endless void of space. "Or a really good backup plan." Mags joined him, her expression weary but determined. "Think we can pull it off?" "Honestly," Vance replied, "I have no idea, but sitting here waiting for the ship to fall apart isn't an option." "Well, when the universe hands you lemons," Mags said, "you make lemon grenades." Vance chuckled, the sound a rare moment of levity in the tension-filled room. "And hope they don't blow up in your face, right?" "Pretty much," she said, crossing her arms. "So what's the next move?" "Get everyone ready," Vance said. "If Harv manages to get a signal out, we might need to move fast, and if not, well, we'll face whatever comes our way." "Sounds like a plan," Mags said, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "Good thing I'm not the optimistic type." "Optimism's overrated anyway," Vance replied, turning his attention back to the monitors. "Let's just focus on getting through the next crisis." As the crew prepared themselves for whatever lay ahead, the Intrepid dawn floated through the starlit abyss, a small defiant speck against the vast, uncaring galaxy. And in that moment, Vance realized that maybe, just maybe, defiance was enough. Because in a universe that seemed hell-bent on wiping them out, there was something to be said for standing your ground, even if it was on a deck that might fall apart at any moment. As the Intrepid dawn floated through the abyss, the crew's nerves were fraying faster than a bargain bin sweater on clearance. Captain Vance Lucky Clayton stood at the helm, contemplating their next move with the kind of expression you'd see on someone about to dive into a pool of acid. "You know, Harv, I was thinking," Vance said, leaning over the malfunctioning console like it might bite him at any moment. "Maybe we should jettison the infected sections of the ship. Could save us a lot of trouble." Harv, who was elbow-deep in wires, looked up with the beleaguered expression of a man who'd been told he'd need to perform open-heart surgery with a spork. "You mean actually get rid of the parts that are trying to kill us? Sounds too simple, Cap." "Yeah, well, sometimes simple is the best option," Vance replied, crossing his arms. "Besides, there's a certain appeal in making a problem someone else's cosmic trash heap." "Fine, fine," Harv said, grumbling as he fiddled with the controls. "I'll see if I can get the ejection system online. Probably needs a good kick." "Just what the doctor ordered," Vance agreed, giving Harv a nod. "Mags, Razak, keep monitoring the crew. If anyone starts sprouting tentacles or glowing in the dark, I want to know about it." "Sure thing, Cap," Mags replied, gesturing towards the screens that flickered like they were having a seizure. "If we're lucky, maybe they'll gain a third eye for better detail." Razak snorted. "Yeah, but knowing us, it'll just be another eye for crying." With Harv working his dubious magic, Vance turned to Celine, one of the few crew members who'd not only stayed sane but had also retained a functional sense of humor. "Celine, I need you to check the power systems. With our luck, they might be the only thing holding this tin can together." Celine, who was busy keeping a malfunctioning monitor from sparking into oblivion, gave a mock salute. "Sure, Cap. I'll see if I can sweet-talk the circuits. Maybe they'll tell me their secrets." "Good," Vance said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because if we can't jettison those sections, we might have to get creative with how we deal with them." The smell of burnt circuits wafted through the control room, adding to the ambience of impending disaster. It was the kind of aroma that made you miss the sterile, oppressive scent of a hospital. Finally, Harv gave a triumphant grunt, looking up with a manic gleam in his eyes. "All right, I think I've got it. Ejection systems are primed and ready. Just say the word, Cap." Vance hesitated, his hand hovering over the control panel. "All right, everyone, buckle up. This could get messy. Or messier." With a decisive press of the button, Vance initiated the sequence to jettison the infected sections. The ship shuddered like an old man with arthritis, groaning and creaking as if it were protesting the loss of its diseased limbs. For a moment, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. The infected sections began to detach, sliding away from the ship with a metallic sigh. But then, in what could only be described as a cosmic slapstick routine, the process came to a screeching halt. "What the hell?" Vance muttered, staring at the monitor that now displayed a delightful array of red warnings. "Harv, what's happening?" Harv stared at the screen with the kind of expression you'd reserve for an extremely poorly timed fart in an elevator. "Looks like some of the sections are stuck. Damn rust buckets won't let go." "Great," Vance said through gritted teeth. "Just great. So now we're dragging dead weight and possibly making things worse." "On the bright side," Razak chimed in, "at least we'll be a little more aerodynamic." "Not sure aerodynamics matter much in space," Mags replied dryly. "But hey, points for optimism." As the crew scrambled to deal with the fallout, Celine emerged from the bowels of the ship with a face that suggested she'd seen something both fascinating and horrifying. "Vance, I think I found something." "What, another problem?" Vance asked, his tone halfway between sarcasm and resignation. "Because we could really use another one of those." Celine shook her head, holding up a smudged tablet. "No, it's the power systems. I think the parasites have a connection to them. They're feeding off the ship's energy." "Feeding off it," Mags echoed, raising an eyebrow. "What are they, cosmic lampreys?" "Pretty much," Celine replied, tapping the screen. "But it means we might be able to manipulate them. Control the power flow, we might control them." Vance considered this, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "So you're saying we can either starve them or give them a sugar rush?" "Exactly," Celine said, a grin creeping across her face. "If we can figure out the right balance, we might be able to negotiate, if you can call it that." "In other words," Harv interjected, "we're going to play zookeeper to a bunch of space parasites." "Lovely. It's the best shot we've got," Vance concluded. "If we can't ditch them, we might as well try to keep them on a leash." The crew regrouped, each member more tired and frazzled than the last. Yet there was a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. "All right, listen up," Vance said, addressing the team. "We're not just running from a problem anymore. We're going to try and outsmart it." Celine stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "We need to reroute power to the non-essential systems, lure the parasites there." It'll be like leading a horse to water, except the horse has tentacles and the water's electricity. So, a normal day on the Dawn, Mags quipped, earning a chuckle from the crew. Let's get to work, Vance ordered. Because if this doesn't pan out, Plan B is still wait for the ship to fall apart. As the crew dispersed, each taking up their roles like soldiers on a battlefield, the weight of uncertainty loomed large. Yet beneath that uncertainty was a strange, stubborn hope, the kind that thrives in the cracks of despair. Celine and Harv, now an unlikely duo of technological wizardry, hunkered down over the control panels. Wires sprawled like a nest of vipers, and each flick of a switch felt like diffusing a bomb. "All right," Celine murmured, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "Let's see if we can't make some friends. Or at least not more enemies," Harv added, his voice tinged with dry humor. "Because I think we're running out of room for those." As the Iors dragged on, the ship became a hive of activity, everyone working with the kind of grim determination that only comes when failure is not just an option but a looming certainty. Sweat and nerves mingled with the ever-present hum of the engines, creating a symphony of survival. Vance moved between stations, offering words of encouragement that were half motivational speech, half gallows humor. "Remember, folks, if we pull this off, drinks are on me. If not, well, consider this the worst hangover of your lives." It was during one of these circuits that he found himself back in the cryo chamber, watching over the crew members who remained in stasis. Their faces were peaceful, unaware of the chaos unfolding beyond their frozen dreams. "Keep resting," Vance muttered, leaning against one of the pods. "Maybe when you wake up, I'll have somehow pulled a miracle out of my ass." The lights flickered, and the ship shuddered again, as if in response to his words. Vance sighed, straightening up. Yeah, I know. I'm working on it." Back on the bridge, Celine and Harv were deep in the final stages of their plan. The screens displayed a dizzying array of data, each line a potential lifeline or a noose. "All right, this is it," Celine announced, her voice a mix of exhaustion and hope. "We're ready to divert power and see if they take the bait." "Okay," Vance said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." With a series of commands, Celine initiated the power transfer. The ship's lights dimmed, a low whine reverberating through the hull as energy flowed away from essential systems. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of their collective breaths, each one held in anticipation. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the ship responded. The parasites, unseen yet ever-present, reacted to the change, latching onto the newly powered systems like moths to a flame. "It's working," Harv said, his voice hushed with disbelief. "They're responding." "Damn, they're actually responding." "All right," Vance said, grinning despite himself. "Let's keep them there. Feed them just enough to keep them happy, but not enough to throw a party." Celine nodded, her fingers flying over the controls. "Now we just need to maintain the balance. A little give and take." "And if they decide they don't like being manipulated?" Mags asked, her tone skeptical. "Then we improvise," Vance replied, the words laced with the kind of reckless confidence that bordered on madness. "Because if there's one thing we're good at, it's making it up as we go." As the crew settled into this new, precarious normal, Vance allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The parasites were contained for now, and the ship continued its slow journey through the void. In the grand, uncaring expanse of space, the Intrepid Dawn and its crew were small, insignificant. Yet within their battered hull they were more than just survivors. They were fighters, dreamers, fools clinging to hope by their fingernails. And in this dark, unforgiving universe that was enough, at least for now. Captain Vance Lucky Clayton leaned against the control panel, surveying the latest round of chaos with a grimace that could curdle milk. "So, anyone else think it smells like a mutiny in here, or is that just the scent of our collective desperation?" Rizat, seated at the communications console, shot him a wry grin. "You know what they say, Cap, nothing brings people together like mutual hatred for their leader." Vance snorted, shaking his head. "Ah, the warm embrace of crew camaraderie warms the cockles of my heart. if I had any left to warm. The control room buzzed with a barely contained tension, like the air before a lightning storm. With the ejection of the malfunctioning sections only half successful, the Intrepid Dawn was still dragging its diseased appendages through the cosmos like a limping dog. As if that wasn't enough, food supplies were dwindling faster than hopes for shore leave. Mags looked up from her station, her fingers still dancing over the array of blinking buttons. Speaking of desperation, how's the menu looking? I'm starting to think we might have to get creative. I've heard cardboard has a certain rustic charm. About as charming as Harv's cooking, Rizak quipped, earning a glare from the engineer who was currently elbow-deep in a console that sparked with every other breath. Hey, my culinary skills are a work of art, Harv retorted, pulling a singed wire from the console. A very abstract kind of art. Vance rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache that had been threatening to set up camp for a while. Focus, people. We need to figure out exactly how bad the food situation is before we start drafting plans to feast on each other. Well, last I checked, Rizaz said, scrolling through her screen, we've got enough rations left to keep us going for another week, if by going you mean slowly starving. Great, Vance muttered. I always wanted to know what it's like to be a skeleton with a sense of humor. Just then, Celine burst into the control room, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and something that might have been fear. Captain, I think I've found something. Please tell me it's a solution and not another problem, Vance said, his voice laced with tired sarcasm. Because our list is getting long enough to rival the ship's manual. Celine shook her head, thrusting a tablet into Vance's hands. It's about the parasites. My research suggests they might not be purely destructive. Not destructive, Harv echoed, sounding like she just suggested the sun was a giant light bulb. You mean all this time they've been here for a friendly chat and a cup of tea, sort of, Celine replied, tapping on the tablet. They seem to have a symbiotic relationship with the ship systems. They're feeding off our energy, yes, but they're also repairing some of the damage caused by the initial impact. Vance glanced at the data, a dubious expression on his face. So you're saying they are uninvited repairmen? Because they seem to be doing a bang-up job of fixing things by breaking others. That's the thing, Celine continued, her voice picking up speed. If we can direct them properly, they might actually help stabilize the ship. A murmur of disbelief ran through the room, like someone had just suggested they try flying the ship using only positive thinking and a prayer. Mags folded her arms, skepticism written all over her face. And how exactly do you plan on asking them nicely to play ball? We manipulate the power flows, Celine explained, pointing at the display. If we can figure out what sections they are drawn to, we could potentially guide them to where they're needed. So, basically, we lure them with an all-you-can-eat buffet of electricity and hope they choose to play nice, Vance summarized, a sardonic twist to his lips. What could possibly go wrong? As the crew began to brainstorm their latest harebrained scheme, the tension in the room crackled dangerously. The situation was teetering on a knife's edge, and it seemed everyone had an opinion on which way it should fall. It was then that a shout echoed from the rear of the ship, a sound that could only mean one thing: trouble. Vance and the others exchanged quick, wary glances before sprinting towards the source. The mess hall was a scene of chaos, a small group of crew members gathered in a heated argument that was one punch away from becoming a brawl. At the center of it all was Harris, a normally quiet crewman who now looked ready to take someone's head off. Enough, Vance barked, forcing his way through the throng to stand between the quarreling factions. What's going on? Harris glared at him, his anger sparking like static electricity. We're sick of this, Captain. We're running out of food, the ship's falling apart, and what are we doing? Playing zookeeper to a bunch of space leeches. Vance met his gaze with a steely calm that belied the turmoil within. We're trying to stay alive, Harris. Unless you've got a better idea, this is the hand we're playing. Maybe we should have a say in how we deal with this, Harris retorted, his voice rising. You can't keep making decisions for us without consulting the crew." Vance felt the weight of the room's eyes on him, the pressure of command a tangible thing. "I understand you're frustrated. Hell, we all are. But mutiny's not going to solve anything. We've got a plan, and if we stick together, we might just pull through this." "Sticking together's easy to say when you're the one calling the shots," Harris muttered, though the fire in his eyes had dimmed somewhat. "We're all in this together," Celine interjected, stepping forward. "And that means finding a way to make this work. For all of us." Her words seemed to have a calming effect, the tension in the room dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Vance nodded, his expression softening. "We don't have to like our options, but right now they are all we've got. So let's get back to work and see this through." The uneasy truce held as the crew dispersed, each person returning to their tasks with the grim determination of those who have no choice but to continue. Vance lingered a moment, watching them go with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "They'll come around," Celine said quietly, joining him as they headed back towards the control room. "They just need something to believe in." Vance nodded, though the uncertainty lingered. "Well, let's hope they're not putting their faith in the wrong fellow, because if this plan doesn't work, we might just be out of miracles." Back on the bridge, the crew resumed their efforts to wrangle the parasites into submission. With Harv's quick fingers and Rizaz's knack for persuasion, the power systems were gradually being rerouted to guide the creatures where they were most needed. "It's like trying to herd cats with a laser pointer," Harv grumbled, peering at the display. "Except the cats are invisible and the lasers made of hopes and dreams." "You really know how to paint a picture, Harv," Mags replied, her tone dripping with irony. "Maybe you should stick to engineering," Rizat chuckled, tapping away at her console. "Or comedy. I hear the market for dark humor's on the rise." Vance watched them work, a small smile tugging at his lips. Despite the dire circumstances, the crew's irreverent camaraderie was a reminder of why they'd survived this long. It was a kind of resilience that couldn't be measured in technical specs or survival manuals. "All right," Celine called out, her focus on the tablet as she adjusted the power flow. "Let's see if we can get those parasites to do a little home renovation." The tension in the room crackled again, though this time it was the electric anticipation of a gamble about to be played. As the systems responded to Celine's commands, the parasites shifted, drawn to the energy like moths to a flame. Slowly, the ship began to stabilize, the creaks and groans of its battered frame easing as the parasites settled in. It was a precarious balance, a tightrope walk without a net, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, fortune seemed to be tilting in their favor. "Looks like it's working," Vance murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how, but it is." "Don't jinx it," Rizak cautioned, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Or next thing you know, we'll be dealing with space gremlins." "One disaster at a time," Vance replied, though his spirits were undeniably lifted. "Let's not borrow trouble from tomorrow when we've got plenty today." As the crew continued their delicate dance with the uninvited guests aboard their ship, a cautious optimism began to take root. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed by the harsh realities of their situation, yet it flickered stubbornly against the dark. In the grand scheme of things, they were still a ragtag band of survivors, clinging to life in a universe that had little regard for their existence. But for the moment, they had a fighting chance, a chance that might just be enough to see them through the night. And in the cold, indifferent vacuum of space, that was something worth holding onto. Celine stood at the control panel, her fingers dancing over the keys like a virtuoso at a keyboard recital nobody wanted to attend. The crew watched, a mix of skepticism and desperation painted on their faces. Rizal leaned back in her seat at the communications console, arms folded, a smirk tugging at her lips. "So, we're whispering sweet nothings to space lice now." "More like yelling sharply at them," Celine replied, her voice tinged with ironic cheer. "Because what else do parasites love more than a stern talking to?" More than a few eyebrows were raised, but with a survival rate plummeting faster than a lead balloon, they had little choice but to entertain the insanity. Vance, standing at the back like a reluctant chaperone at a teenage disco, crossed his arms. Last time I checked, our job description didn't include parasite diplomacy. Welcome to the new job market, Harv chimed in, still tinkering with wires like they were the strings of a particularly troublesome puppet. Innovative solutions for innovative problems, which is corporate speak for nobody knows what the hell they are doing, Mags added, not missing a beat as she typed in commands that only half made sense to her on a good day. Celine took a deep breath and continued her work, redirecting the ship's power through a series of convoluted pathways. She had to lure the parasites away from the critical systems and use them to patch up the ship's wounded hull. If we pull this off, not only do we get to live, but I'll probably get a nice little footnote in the next edition of How Not to Fly a Spaceship. Footnote or obituary, what's the difference? Vance muttered, eyes scanning the readouts with a mixture of hope and disdain. He might have been the captain, but sometimes it felt like he was the ringleader of a particularly unstable circus. Rizal rolled her eyes, but there was a flicker of something like admiration in her gaze. Hey, if you're going to go down, might as well be memorable. Right, Captain? Oh sure, why not? Vance replied, sarcasm dripping from every word. I've always wanted my last words to be I told you so. As Celine worked, the ship groaned and shuddered like an old man getting out of bed. The parasites were shifting, drawn to the redirected energy like pensioners to an early bird special. The crew watched the screens with bated breath, every creak and clank echoing ominously through the control room. Is it just me, or does it feel like we're in a haunted house? Mags whispered, her fingers poised over the keyboard as if they could stop disaster with sheer willpower. Only you're paying twice the price and there's no exit, Harv shot back, pulling another charred wire from the console with the weary resignation of someone who knew this dance all too well. The ship suddenly jolted, the lights sputtering as if unsure whether to commit to full illumination or a more dramatic flickering. The crew grabbed onto whatever they could as alarms blared, a discordant symphony of impending doom. Okay, what now? Vance demanded, pushing himself back into a semblance of control. The ship seemed to have a penchant for bad timing, delivering fresh hells when they were least needed. Harv was already checking the systems, his fingers moving faster than a gambler trying to cheat at cards. Looks like a power surge. Systems are trying to compensate, but it's like patching a sinking boat with duct tape. Fantastic, Rizad drawled, her fingers flying over her console as she attempted to stabilize communications. And here I was worried we might have a dull day. Celine's eyes were glued to her screen, her focus intense. We're still in control. Just need to keep them moving, lure them to the right spots. The ship groaned again, a metallic protest that seemed to reverberate through their bones. Vance could feel the tension in the room ratchet up another notch, like a rope being pulled too tight. Everyone hold together, he ordered, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. We get through this, we might actually have a shot. The crew worked with a frenetic energy born of necessity as the ship trembled around them. Vance watched his crew, a ragtag bunch of misfits who somehow made the chaos bearable. If they couldn't pull this off, he'd at least make sure they went down swinging. A sudden explosion rocked the ship, throwing them all off balance. Sparks flew from a panel and Rizal let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Now what? Vance barked, struggling to keep his footing on the tilting deck. Looks like one of the conduits blew, Harv replied, his voice rising over the din. The parasites are overloading the system, probably not too keen on their new job assignments. Great, mutiny by microorganisms, Mags quipped, but there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed her nerves. We've got to reroute the power, Celine said urgently, fingers flying as she tried to regain control. Get them back on track before they tear us apart from the inside. On it, Harv replied, diving back into the maze of circuits and wires. He muttered to himself as he worked, a habit that annoyed some but kept him sane. Just another day in paradise. The lights flickered again, casting the room into a strobe-like nightmare that made everything feel surreal. Vance could feel the ship straining against the forces tearing it apart, a creaking metal beast fighting for life. "Reza, get me status updates on the critical systems," Vance ordered, his mind racing with possibilities. "I need to know what's still functioning before we have more surprises." "On it, Cap," Reza shot back, her hands moving with precise efficiency despite the chaos around them. "Looks like we've lost some non-essentials, but core systems are holding, barely. Non-essentials." Mag snorted, trying to keep her tone light even as her heart hammered in her chest. "There goes my spa day." "Don't worry," Vance said dryly. "I hear next week the sauna's running a special on hot steam and stress relief." As Celine continued her work, the ship's systems began to stabilize, the parasites reluctantly drawn back from the brink of disaster. It was a temporary reprieve, but in their world, temporary was more than they dared hope for. "We've got them back on track," Celine reported, her voice tight with concentration. "If we can keep them moving, they should help reinforce the hull." "And if not?" Harv asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer but was hoping for a better one. "Then we better start praying to whichever cosmic deity has the least sense of humor," Celine replied, only half joking. The crew fell silent, the weight of their situation pressing down on them with an almost physical force. Below the surface banter, the fear was palpable, a living thing that fed on their doubts and insecurities. Vance took a deep breath, forcing himself to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "All right, folks, we keep doing what we can, one step at a time. We haven't made it this far just to roll over now. And if we do roll over," Reza added with a grim chuckle, "at least it'll be a hell of a story, right?" "Sure," Vance replied, allowing himself a small smile. "Just make sure someone writes it down before the end credits roll." The crew settled into a tense rhythm, each member focusing on their tasks with renewed determination. The parasites continued to shift, guided by Celine's efforts, and the ship slowly began to stabilize. Hours passed in a blur of activity, the crew working tirelessly to maintain the fragile balance they'd achieved. The ship still groaned and shuddered, but the imminent threat of disintegration seemed to be held at bay, for now. As they worked, Vance found himself watching his crew with a mixture of pride and affection. They were an odd bunch, each one more flawed than the last, but together they'd forged a bond as unbreakable as the vacuum outside their hull. "Okay, team," he said, his voice carrying the weariness of a long day. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we've bought ourselves some time. Let's make the most of it." Celine nodded, her face set in determination. "I'll keep monitoring the parasites, make sure they stay on track. And I'll keep trying to coax a little more life out of these systems," Harv added, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "Sounds like a plan," Mags agreed, her fingers still dancing over her console. "Just another day at the office, right?" Rizat chuckled, the sound a rare bright spot in the dim control room. "Yeah, if the office was on fire and filled with man-eating bugs." Despite the dire circumstances, the crew shared a moment of camaraderie, a brief respite from the chaos that had become their norm. They might not be out of danger, but they were far from done fighting. As the Intrepid dawn sailed through the vast, uncaring expanse of space, its crew clung to hope as fiercely as they did each other. In a universe that seemed determined to crush them, they'd learned to survive by sheer force of will and a healthy dose of gallows humor. And for now, that would have to be enough. The Intrepid Dawn, a ship more patchwork than pristine, drifted through the black void like a tipsy ghost. Inside, the crew clung to their sanity by a thread, each member a cog in a malfunctioning machine that seemed hell-bent on self-destruction. The parasites, those unwelcome guests, had found a rhythm, albeit an unpredictable one, but their presence was still an itch that couldn't be scratched. Celine, the unspoken conductor of their chaotic orchestra, was hunched over her console, fingers flying like she was trying to beat some universal typing speed record. She'd been at it for hours, trying to find a way to tap into the parasite's bizarre network. "If I manage this," she mumbled, "not quite to anyone but herself, I expect a medal. Or at least a decent meal. Make it a double," Vance grunted from the corner, his eyes fixed on a readout as if staring hard enough might change the numbers. "We're overdue for a break that doesn't involve explosions or space bugs." Rizah, ever the cynic with a dash of misplaced optimism, chimed in from her communications console. "Cap, you know the universe serves irony like a five-star chef. If we get a break, expect it to come with an unexpected garnish of doom. My favorite appetizer," Vance replied, the sarcasm rolling off his tongue like honey tainted with vinegar. Meanwhile, Harv was neck-deep in circuitry, his toolbox a mess of tools and wire like a surgeon with the shakes. "You know, if we ever get out of this mess, I might just retire. Find a nice planet with no technology and live like a hermit. Just make sure it's not inhabited by space ticks," Mags quipped, the corners of her lips twitching upwards as she continued her own dance across the keys. "We wouldn't want you getting bored." The ship gave its signature groan, a sound as reassuring as a creaking coffin. Celine tightened her grip on the console, her focus cutting through the noise. I think I've got something," she announced, voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. Vance moved to her side, peering over her shoulder without a clue of what he was looking at. "You're not about to tell me you've hacked into the intergalactic net, are you?" "Nope. But I might have just found a way to talk to our little stowaways." Celine tapped a few keys, bringing up a stream of alien data that looked more like a toddler's scribble than anything useful. "Talk to them." "Well, that's novel," Rizah interjected, her voice dripping with skepticism. "And when you say talk, you mean?" "More like negotiate," Celine replied, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "These parasites, they're not random. They've got some kind of structure, like ants with a bad sense of direction." "Ants," Vance echoed, crossing his arms, a picture of disbelief. "And we're supposed to convince them to play nice." "Unless you've got a better idea," Celine shot back, her fingers never pausing. "Look, they're drawn to energy, right? But if we can regulate the flow, we might not just keep them from tearing us apart, we might actually use them." The room went silent, each crew member digesting this new, bizarre possibility. It was a long shot, but long shots were their bread and butter. "So, what's our angle?" Harv asked, finally wrenching himself free from the guts of the console to join the conversation. "Do we offer them room and board, more like free electricity?" Celine answered, eyes flicking between her console and the captain. "We regulate power, they stabilize the ship. We become indispensable to each other. Symbiosis," Mags said with a shrug. "Sounds less like science fiction, more like a bad marriage." Vance sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's say we try this. What's our opening line?" "Hey there, sorry for the extermination attempts, want to be friends." Something like that, Celine grinned. "I'll start by sending a series of pulses through the system. We'll see if they respond." As Celine initiated the sequence, the room filled with a tense anticipation, the kind where everyone held their breath and hoped not to hear the sound of things exploding. The ship's groans quieted, replaced by the soft hum of energy coursing through new paths. "If this works, I'm going to start believing in magic," Rizah muttered, eyes glued to her screens for any sign of incoming disasters. Minutes ticked by like hours, each second stretching into eternity. Then, ever so slowly, the data changed. The parasites, those stubborn hitchhikers, altered their pattern, drawn to the controlled energy flow like moths to a flame. "Son of a gun," Harv breathed, mouth agape. "Is it just me, or are we actually getting somewhere?" "Don't jinx it," Vance warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not out of the woods yet." Celine kept her focus, adjusting the pulses with careful precision. It was a delicate balance, a dance of numbers and wavelengths that made her head spin. But it was working. Against all odds, the parasites were adapting, stabilizing the parts of the ship they'd previously threatened to destroy. "Okay, we've got a response," Celine said, her voice a mix of triumph and disbelief. "They're actually regulating the energy flow. It's It's like they're cooperating. Rizal repeated, a mix of incredulity and awe. Next thing you'll tell me they're planning a surprise party. She's right, Mags added, tapping her console with renewed vigor. The systems are balancing. It's like the parasites are. Helping. Vance allowed himself a moment of hope. I'll be damned. Maybe we should start charging rent. The crew shared a nervous laugh. The weight of their predicament momentarily lifted. It was a fragile peace, but in their universe, peace was a rare and precious thing. Let's not get too comfortable, Harv cautioned, his usual pessimism throwing cold water on their celebration. This is great and all, but these parasites are as predictable as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. True, Celine agreed, her expression sobering. We need to keep monitoring them. If they so much as twitch in the wrong direction, we've got to be ready. Rizan nodded, already setting up additional alerts on her console. I'll keep an eye out for any changes. The moment they start acting up, we'll know. All right, team, Vance said, his voice regaining its usual authority. We keep this up, keep them in check, and maybe, just maybe, we'll limp out of this yet. The ship settled into a new rhythm, the creaks and groans subdued, replaced by a steady hum of cooperation. It was far from perfect, but perfection was a myth long abandoned by this crew. As the Iors dragged on, the crew worked tirelessly, each member contributing their own brand of expertise and tenacity. They monitored the parasites, adjusted power flows, and held their breath with each new development. By some small miracle, the parasites remained cooperative, their presence no longer an immediate threat but a reluctant ally. It was a tenuous balance, one that could shift with the slightest misstep, but for now it held. Despite the odds, despite the universe's penchant for disaster, the Intrepid Dawn and her crew had found a way to survive. They were bruised, battered, and exhausted, but they were still flying, still fighting. In a galaxy that seemed intent on swallowing them whole, they'd carved out a sliver of hope. All right, everyone, Vance said, breaking the silence with the authority of a captain who'd seen too much and survived it all. We've got a new plan, a new ally, and a chance. Let's make sure we don't waste it. Celine nodded, her fingers still dancing across her console. I'll keep refining the signals, make sure we're in sync. If these parasites are going to be part of the team, they better start pulling their weight. Just don't let them unionize, Harv added with a dry chuckle, the humor a welcome balm to their frayed nerves. As the crew continued their work, a sense of camaraderie wrapped around them like a comforting shroud. They'd faced the abyss together, and somehow, miraculously, they'd found a way to push it back. They might not have all the answers, but they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, the crew of the Intrepid Dawn allowed themselves to breathe, to savor the briefest taste of victory. It was a small triumph, a fragile piece in an uncaring universe, but it was theirs, and that, in the grand scheme of things, was more than enough. The Intrepid Dawn settled into an uneasy peace, a bit like a cat that's decided for now not to shred the curtains. The crew, battered and running on the fumes of adrenaline and sarcasm, took stock of their situation. For the first time in a while, the ship wasn't actively trying to kill them. Small victories. All right, team, Captain Vance Lucky Clayton said, wishing the coffee machine wasn't just another casualty of their adventures. We've got a parasitic partnership that's holding for now. Let's not look this gift horse in the mouth. Unless it sneezes. Razaz snorted, her hands flying across the communications console like a pianist at a recital for the tone-deaf. I'm filing this under things I never thought I'd see in space. Right next to intelligent life forms wearing Hawaiian shirts. There was a certain elegance to those shirts, Harv said, idly spinning a spanner. He'd been threatening to retire to a tech-free planet for years, but if anyone asked, he'd only smirk and say, someday. Speaking of elegance, Mags chimed in. How about we fix this junk heap before it decides to have another existential crisis? Celine was still glued to her console, fingers typing a symphony of ones and zeros, occasionally glancing up to ensure nobody was actively combusting. I'm working on a way to improve their cooperation. If we're gonna have stowaways, might as well make them full crew members. A crew that doesn't eat our food. Sounds like paradise, Vance quipped, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his not-so-vast or prosperous domain. Or a bad joke, Rizat added, tapping a few more commands. Speaking of which, I'm patching into the main comms network. We should probably let Command know we're not dead. Yet, Vance corrected, ever the optimist or, in his case, the pessimist with a sense of humor. Make it sound like a miracle. Maybe they'll send us a bonus. Rizat gave a wry smile. Sure thing, Cap. Dear Command, miracle achieved. Awaiting further instructions and a crate of something that doesn't taste like reheated shoe leather. Add a side note. Please include socks, Harv grumbled, pulling a mismatched pair over his feet. I'm starting to think they're sentient and planning a revolt. Celine's console beeped, startling her. Good news, folks. Our little buddies are responding even better to the adjustments. We might actually be able to use this as a bargaining chip with Command. Just what we need, Vance said dryly. To be the poster kids for how to make friends and influence parasites. I can see the book deal now. Better than the alternative, Mags noted, glancing at the flickering lights. Let's try not to let this get to our heads. I'm sure the universe is just waiting to test our newfound confidence. Rizat finished her communication with Command, half expecting a laugh track to play in response. Message sent. Now we wait to see if they remember we exist. If they don't, we could always rename the ship the SS Nobody Cares, Harv suggested, dry as dust. We'd save a fortune on fuel if we just drifted away into the void. Chin up, Harv, Vance said. Even pessimists need a break from being right all the time. They worked on repairs, a chore that felt like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing and the other half were on fire. But they were getting there, bit by bit. The ship began to purr, a sound that was almost comforting if you ignored the fact it was also slightly menacing. Dampeners are back online, Mags reported, wiping grease from her hands. At least we won't be turned into human pancakes if we hit a bump. That's a relief, Celine said. I always thought Intrepid Dawn pancake mix had a certain ring to it, Vance chuckled. We'd probably end up tasting better than the current rations. You're just saying that because you haven't had to eat your own cooking, Rizat shot back. Though I'm sure even the parasites would pass. Time ticked by, the crew working with an ease born of chaos. They were a ragtag bunch, but they'd come through more than one scrape together. There was a twisted kind of comfort in their camaraderie, a bond forged in the fires of near disaster. Then the comms crackled to life. Intrepid Dawn, this is Command. We received your message. Congratulations on surviving. Again. How's the situation? Alive against all odds, Vance replied, voice smooth as silk. We've made a deal with our parasitic pals. Thought you'd want to know before we start charging them rent. We're intrigued, Command replied, their curiosity evident even across the void. Gather all data. We're sending extraction. Expect an escort in 72 hours. 72 hours, Rizat repeated, disbelief coding her words. That's what? 3 eternities in space-time. Plenty of time to clean up, Vance said, glancing around at the barely controlled chaos of their ship. And maybe iron out a few wrinkles in our shiny new alliance. Or cause more wrinkles, Harv muttered, ever the realist. But hey, what's a little more chaos amongst friends? With the countdown ticking, they set to work. The parasites, now less of a threat and more like uninvited house guests, continued their odd cooperation. It was bizarre, but then again, so was life on the Intrepid Dawn. I'm telling you, Celine said, if we pull this off, I'm taking a vacation. Somewhere warm with zero chance of infection by space bugs. Sounds heavenly, Mags agreed, resetting a panel. Count me in. I'll bring the sunscreen. Rizat glanced at her console, keeping one eye on the ship's vitals, the other on their new allies. For now, let's just focus on staying alive until the cavalry arrives. Always the pragmatic one, Vance said, admiration lacing his sarcasm. But you're right. Let's keep our eyes on the prize. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. the crew running on caffeine and stubborn willpower. Repairs continued, systems were optimized, and even the parasites seemed to have settled into their new roles as reluctant allies. Finally, as promised, their escort arrived. The sleek ships flanked the Intrepid Dawn, a welcome sight against the endless expanse of space. "Looks like we've got company," Harv noted, peering at the display. "Try to look presentable," Vance advised, straightening his rumpled uniform. "We've got a reputation to uphold." "Reputation for what?" Mags asked, raising an eyebrow. "Surviving by the skin of our teeth." "Exactly," Vance said with a grin. "Let's not disappoint." The crew assembled, the ship's systems humming with a newfound stability. It was a strange triumph, this partnership with their unwelcome guests, but a triumph nonetheless. "All right, folks," Vance said, his voice carrying the weight of their journey. "We've got a lot to report, a lot to explain, but we made it. And that's no small feat." The escort ships maneuvered alongside them, a testament to their victory, however temporary. They'd face the abyss and come back with a story to tell. "So what now?" Reza asked, glancing around at her crewmates, her friends. "Now," Vance replied, "we show them what humans are made of. Tenacity, ingenuity, and just a hint of madness." As the Intrepid Dawn prepared to return to human-controlled space, the crew allowed themselves a moment of hope. They'd survived against all odds, and somewhere in the chaos, they'd found something worth holding onto. In a universe that seemed determined to grind them down, they'd stood their ground. And as they set course for their next adventure, one thing was certain: they were far from finished.